This video is about World War I and ultimately the causes and outcomes of the war. So World War I is going to take place between 1914 and 1918 and is really going to be the first war in human history that's going to involve people from all over the place, right? You have people that are going to be coming in from Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas, right? This is one of the reasons why the war is going to get the name the Great War. And if you think about it, the reasoning why you have these people from all over the place is after our discussions on imperialism, you can see how this imperialistic relationship between your father country, your parent country, and their colonies are going to lead to the inclusion of people from these colonies to fight this war when it truly becomes something into the astronomical scales that they had seen previously. Let's take a quick look at the map of Europe, kind of right leading up to World War I, right? I think it's important to kind of note the now establishment of Germany and Italy that had taken place in the end of the 1800s when they ultimately unified, right? And Germany in particular becoming this unified force is going to be a bit of a thorn in the side of these European countries, right? Because the unification of these German kingdoms is going to lead to an extremely powerful state that now suddenly exists right in the center of Europe. And this is truly disrupts the scales. It's disrupting to everything that had been going on. And when Germany ultimately fights a war against France in the Franco-Prussian War and is victorious, it's only going to disrupt that even more. So I think it's important to kind of take a look at how things are prior to the war so that we can really kind of understand where they are going to be going. So let's look at the causes of World War I. There are a number of different points here. There are really four big ones that you're going to be responsible for knowing, and one of the words that you should be familiar with is the word MAIN, M-A-I-N, because that acts as an acronym to understand the different causes of the war, right? So the M would stand for militarism, the A is going to stand for alliances, the I for imperialism, and N for nationalism, right? So let's take a look at each of these things now individually to truly kind of understand how they are going to have an effect in creating this war and fostering the conditions that lead to the breakdown of diplomatic relationships and things like that that give us this powder keg effect that will ultimately explode into the war. The first word we're going to be looking at is nationalism, right? And to define nationalism, we really just need to kind of talk about an overwhelming sense of pride that someone is going to develop about their country, right? And this nationalism is a phenomenon that's going to begin to really take shape toward the end of the 1800s and early 1900s in Europe, especially in some of these countries that are now unified, in particular places like Germany and in Italy. And people are going to be prideful about what their country is accomplishing. And that sense of nationalism and pride is going to enable these nations to get themselves into this war where all these people are basically willing to join up for the good of the country. You saw it in some of the videos we watched in class. All these young people signing up, ready to give their lives for the cause if necessary. And one of those things that is leading to this nationalistic sense of pride throughout Europe and really throughout the world is the idea of imperialism, right? The idea that you as a country may be able to take over and control other areas and other regions of the world and basically take the resources and utilize the people for your own gain. This is kind of seen as a prideful thing, right? If you are able to do this, this kind of implies to them anyway that they are better than these people. And what they are hoping to do is Christianize, but also make them similar to the mother and parent country because, again, to them, it's feeling like they are better. So this is one of those areas of contention because as these countries in Europe begin to take over areas in Africa and in Asia, you get some butting up against each other, right? If you look at the map, you can see areas where France is butting up against areas of the United Kingdom's colonies and German kingdoms, right? And so all of a sudden you have this situation where it creates a bit of friction that is going on along the borders, but also between the powers of Europe. Going back to the list here for a second to talk about the idea of militarism, right? So now that we have this friction that is occurring between these countries in Europe near their colonies or back at home, what is going to happen now is this sense of militarism, this idea of militarism taking place, where if one country decides to kind of try to protect themselves and put say troops on the border, the other country is going to have to kind of respond in kind just to make sure that they are protected, right? So if one side might put 100,000 troops on the border, the other side might put an equal amount or more, and if say they put 120, then the other side has to go back and put 20,000 more to equal it, and this is kind of a situation where you get this snowball effect now, where you have this massive amount of troops and military pieces basically along these borders in this militarized fashion, ready to go at a moment's notice and mobilize if the call for war is broken out. The next piece of this puzzle is the entangling alliances that developed throughout the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. And you can see a very good chart of this here, but in class what we did is we likened this kind of to a schoolroom brawl, right? Where you have maybe friends with people, and ultimately when a fight breaks out between someone, their friends kind of jump into the fight, and you get a brawl that's a lot larger than really might have been necessary here, right? And that's essentially what kind of took place on the world stage, because when the Serbian nationalists of the Black Hand killed the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, Austria kind of felt like they had to do something about it. So when they attempted to do something and kind of move in against Serbia, Russia came into their defense. And when Russia came into their defense, you basically had France saying that they might need to get into, and Germany joins on the side of Austria-Hungary and Italy and the Ottoman Empire. And then all of a sudden you have this situation where this war is kind of is a lot larger than anyone kind of anticipated at first. So once things actually break out and this brawl begins between these European powers, the alliances that are going to take shape are kind of right in front of you here, right? So you have the two sides that exist. You have what are known as the Central Powers that are headed by Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria in particular. And then you have on the other side, the Entente powers, the allies, if you will, led by France, Great Britain. Russia will be in, but ultimately be forced to leave the war in 1917 as a result of the Russian Revolution going on in their own country. You have the United States, who's going to be forced to get into the war in 1917 as well, as a result of some other things we'll be talking about in a bit. And then you also have this large supporting cast on the Allies of other smaller entities and regional powers and colonies that are really having a huge part of this war, which is one of the reasons why we, again, can call this a truly world war. To show that visually here, we have a really good map that kind of breaks it down, right? In green, you have the countries that fell onto the side of the Allies, the Entente powers. In the red, you have the countries that are going to side with the Central powers. And you can see the Central powers kind of make sense because they are more or less centrally located throughout Europe. I would just like to point out Germany's location here. Remember, Germany really wasn't actually a thing not all that long prior, and when the kingdoms come together and form Germany and fight a war with France, and are ultimately the winners, that's going to be a rather large disruptive event in Europe, right? And at this point, you're only going to have just significantly more development with the Industrial Revolution and Germany's own industrializing, and that's going to really make Germany one of these largest powers and most formidable powers in Europe, right? So they have a lot at stake here. So when ultimately the heir to the throne is assassinated of Austria-Hungary, and they feel that they need to kind of do something about it, and they're going to kind of have actions against Serbia. When Russia then is going to back up Serbia, Germany needs to make a decision here, right? And if they are going to back their friend Austria-Hungary here, this has the potential of turning into a much larger war, and Germany needs to do everything in their power to get the upper hand here. So when you have France and Russia on either side of you, you need to kind of devise a plan to make that work. And this is going to be one of the reasons why Germany is going to act decisively and quickly at the start of all of these hostilities, because they don't really see any other way, is ultimately my point. And we're going to talk about the events that actually spark this powder keg in just a second, but I guess my overall point is, in World War I, there's really no clear bad guy like there is in World War II. In World War I, it's just countries looking out for themselves, and Germany is kind of between a rock and a hard place with these two major industrial powers on either side, and they need to do something if they have any shot of being able to successfully win this war. This is another great map because not only does it show what we were just looking at on a much smaller scale, we now have it brought out to the whole world here, right? So you can really truly see the effect of this war and the outreach from the parent countries to their colonies and such that they had controlled, and how much they are really drawing from them to kind of fight this war, which is, again, what really makes this a global war in the first place. I like this political cartoon quite a bit because it really shows the attitude here, right? Everyone is pointing fingers at somebody else as if saying that they're the ones that are going to start this war. And the caption, right, the crime of the ages, who did it? Who started this war? Whose fault is it, right? And it's not a question that's going to be answered early on, and ultimately at the conclusion of the war, when there are true victors and true losers here, the blame is going to be put on somebody. It's kind of now time to talk about the event that sparks off all of the mayhem. Also, the other major events of the war. We're not going to be going into the nitty-gritty talking about battles and how many people lost lives here or there, but there are some things that we need you to kind of know about outside of that type of stuff, right? So the first big event that we need to be aware of is the assassination of Austria's Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo. This is going to be the spark that lights the fuse of the powder keg, as we've kind of been talking about, right? And the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the prince, and he is the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So when he's assassinated, it's a pretty big deal. And that's going to be the reason why this now descends into absolute chaos. So very briefly talking about the story, you have this situation where the Austria-Hungarian Empire was controlling areas as part of their empire in the Balkans and in Serbia, right? So you have the heir, Franz Ferdinand. He is going to be kind of visiting the area, in particular in Sarajevo, and there are a group of Serbians that are not particularly fond of not having their own sovereignty and being controlled by Austria-Hungary. And when the Archduke comes, this group of people known as the Black Hand decide it is going to be in their interests to attempt to kill the Archduke. And the Archduke is having this kind of grand parade route. He's going to be kind of traveling around the city, and the Black Hand gets ready for him, and they are basically establish themselves on the route as a means of basically trying to take control and ultimately to kill him. So that's what happens, right? The Archduke is traveling along his route, and some of these men are ready for him. And at one point, you're going to have one of these conspirators throw essentially what amounts to a bomb at the Archduke's car, and it's going to bounce off the back of the Archduke's car. It's going to actually blow up onto the car behind them, and the Archduke is going to ultimately get away. The conspirator is going to essentially not want to get captured, and he's going to take a cyanide capsule, which is meant to kill him, and then he's going to jump off a nearby bridge. And sadly, I guess for this conspirator anyway, the cyanide wasn't quite strong enough, and it doesn't have the effect of intended of killing him, and the bridge actually isn't all high enough or the water deep enough, and he ends up breaking his legs in addition to being sick on the cyanide and gets captured, right? But the Archduke gets away, and ultimately he is going to end up by complete coincidence in front of this street corner where one of the conspirators happened to be waiting, just again by complete coincidence. And this man is named Gavrilo Princip, and he is on the right of your screen there, and he is going to ultimately kill the Archduke and his wife, right? And this is going to again set off this chain of events known as the July Crisis, where these failures of diplomatic relations is going to now lead us to war. And once the machinations of war kind of get going and the militarization and all of that stuff, right, the entangling alliance system just kind of starts to drag everybody into this conflict. It's like pulling a pin from a grenade, and, was it possible to maybe put the pin back in? Yes, but it was also not necessarily in the best interests of these countries to be slow to mobilize here, right? Because if they're slow to mobilize and their enemy is quick to mobilize, how much territory could that enemy potentially take before they were ready, right? So that's an important part here. So everyone's kind of getting ready rather quickly, just in case the war truly does break out, because they don't want to be left behind. And that attitude is going to be one of the things that is going to really kind of ensure that this war actually does happen. This is a great map because it shows the percentages of population of these countries that are going to ultimately be mobilized for this war during the 4-year period, right? Between 1914 and 1918, you can see these heavy, high percentages of these countries, right? Bulgaria is going to mobilize over 20% of its population to fight this war. France as well, over 20. Great Britain, pretty close to 20%. Germany, 17%, and so on, right? This is pretty staggering because when you have high death rates as well, at the end of the day, when these people are going to come home following the conclusion of the war, right, you have a massive dip in population as a result, and it's going to have lasting effects for years and years beyond the war. Ultimately, another reason why this map is important as well is it kind of shows the sheer magnitude of the people that are going to be involved in this conflict, right? You have a situation where Germany is going to mobilize almost 11 million people, and that, the numbers here are staggering in comparison to what had occurred any other time throughout European history, throughout world history, really. And it's going to create this devastating conflict of just destruction everywhere, and people, being killed in massive, massive numbers, as we talked about in class. And it's pretty intense, right? It's pretty crazy to think about what a total war effort really means, and the amount of resources and things that are being thrown at this conflict, hoping that they're going to be successful. So after the assassination of the Archduke, you're going to have Germany swing to go attack France, right? And when Germany does that, it's going to start the war. And the Germans' hope was that they could ultimately knock out France out of this war before Russia was truly able to get involved, so that if France was out, then Germany could focus all of their efforts on Russia. That's the way that they could fight this two-front war, and the reason why they had to strike first and mobilize to make that timeline fit, right? But in order to do that, they actually had to go through a neutral country of Belgium. The French had militarized all along the German-French border, anticipating that a conflict might break out at any point, and it would have been very difficult. But where the French weren't is on the French-Belgium border all that much. So Germany thought that they could just kind of slip through Belgium without Belgium doing anything about it, and that they could just kind of walk through and surprise France on the other side, and effectively knock them out quickly. And the Belgians, we know, are not going to take kindly to that, and they are actually going to their credit, attack this behemoth of German forces heading through their country, even though that they are a much smaller force and we're going to be significantly overrun very quickly as a result. But that action by Belgium is going to buy France enough time, and then the British are going to get into the conflict because Germany did not respect Belgium's neutrality by going through the country, and at this point now you have what's going to break into the stalemate that is going to characterize the next 3+ years of this war. So as far as events go, we are going to talk about the United States getting in the war, right? I said we're not going to be talking about the nitty gritty of the battles and things like that of that 3-year period, there's obviously a lot that goes on and occurs during it, but we are kind of skipping now ahead to the United States getting into the war in 1917. So, what drives the United States to get into the war? It's really not any one thing, right? There's going to be a number of events and variables that are going to go into the decision for the United States to get into the war. One of them being the situation with the Lusitania, which is a passenger liner that's going back and forth between England and the United States, is going to be sunk by a German submarine on May 7th, 1915. And the reason why this is a big deal is because there were American passengers on board of this passenger liner, and it's also kind of just it's not a good look for the Germans to be sinking passenger liners right on the world stage. The Germans at this point don't necessarily care because obviously a war is on, and the war situation is probably more important than their reputation. But ultimately, you have the Americans bringing weapons across on these passenger liners, and this wasn't really known at the time, but the Germans suspected it and claimed that this was going on, so they did not want those weapons to get to the front, so they sink the passenger liner. Britain and America deny any involvement of sending supplies back and forth on these passenger liners, but the Germans sink the ship anyway, and it becomes this big ordeal, and the American public start to turn against the Germans as a result. And this isn't the one event that's going to get the Americans into the war, but it is going to have a major factor on the decrease in German sentiment in America and more willingness to kind of get involved in the conflict if necessary. The next situation that's going to kind of push the Americans toward war is when the Germans are going to send a telegram to Mexico. And this telegram is going to suggest that the Mexicans actually begin a conflict with the United States. And you can read it on your own time if you pause the video here. But basically, what the telegram says is that Americans had taken territory from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. And as a result, Mexico lost all this territory, and the Germans are suggesting, wouldn't it be great if you guys could get that back, right? The Germans were very worried about the United States going to potentially get involved in this conflict, and they wanted to delay that as long as they can so that they could hopefully finish the war in Europe prior to this, right? Prior to the American involvement. So any delay, they felt they could do this, and that's why they suggest Mexico to kind of strike against the United States, and the Germans say that they would back Mexico in this conflict with the United States if they are going to be brazen enough to start a war like that. And ultimately, once the Germans were successful in Europe, the thought was that they would then mobilize and get over to North America to help the Mexicans fight their own war, where they could then reclaim that territory in the Western Hemisphere. So that telegram was going to be intercepted by the British and given to the Americans, and the Americans obviously aren't going to like the idea of Germany provoking Mexico to start a war with the United States. So this is only going to actually push it even closer to a brink of war, and we will actually be at war not much long later. This, again, it's not any one of these particular things. The Germans were also practicing what's called unrestricted submarine warfare at this point as a means of trying to strangle the Allies from getting supplies to the continent. So they were using their submarines to basically torpedo any Allied shipping that they could that might be carrying supplies and things to mainland Europe. And this was choking out the Allies, essentially, strangling them. And it's also tricky because there were civilians on these vessels, but then the question comes down to, if there were civilians, are they truly civilians, I suppose, right? If they're carrying back and forth war supplies, does that allow them, and does that make them to, I guess, hide under the guise of being civilians? And the Germans didn't think so, which is why they were practicing this, but it obviously wasn't very popular with the Allies. So this is going to be one of the reasons why the United States is going to be pushed towards the war. And ultimately, not much longer after this, and Woodrow Wilson beginning his second term, the United States is going to be forced into the war in 1917. And while the United States is going to get into the war, Russia is actually going to be forced to leave the war because of their Russian Revolution that is occurring in their own country. And the Russian Revolution is going to lead to the death of the Tsar and the rise of the Bolsheviks and the communists and communism in what's going to effectively stop being Russia and become the Soviet Union. And it's a pretty big deal that Russia is going to be forced to leave this war, right? Because that's going to now allow Germany to stop having to worry about a two-front war, and it's going to allow them to kind of swing and focus their forces in the West, on the Western Front, in hopes that they will be able to kind of finalize this war before the Americans truly are able to get their troops trained and mobilized and brought to Europe. And that's the hope. So you're going to see a large offensives now being planned with the remainder of the troops that had been basically situated to fight Russia that are now able to swing to the Western Front. This is another pretty good map that's going to show kind of the lines and how the lines are going to break down here. So if you look on the far west there, that purple dotted line is essentially as far as the Germans get in their initial push. You can see they only get really it's something like 20 miles outside of Paris. They're almost within range of their guns before the Allied coalition is able to kind of push them back and stop them, what's called on the Miracle on the Marne, and able to kind of reverse the tide of that advance. And you will ultimately get a line kind of a bit farther to the east, right? And that's where you're going to get this stalemate now, the stalemate of the weapons and things like that, not allowing people to kind of be above ground all that much, because if they were, then ultimately it causes problems, because it's just suicidal on some level to be facing machine guns and tanks and mustard gas and artillery shells and all of that stuff that are being thrown from either side here. It's just suicidal to be above the ground, which is why you're going to get the trenches that are going to be dug and the trench system that is going to encompass much of this war and be what people are very familiar with about World War I. So let's just do a quick recap of the leaders of these countries, right? People that you need to be familiar with is a man named Kaiser Wilhelm II, who is the German emperor. You have Tsar Nicholas II, who is the emperor of Russia. You have Vladimir Lenin, who is going to lead the Bolshevik Revolution and ultimately be put in charge of the Soviet Union. Then you have Woodrow Wilson, who is the president of the United States. That are your major players that you need to familiarize yourself with. As we were talking about just a second ago, right, these new weapons that are going to encompass World War I are truly devastating, right? This warfare has changed drastically since Napoleonic times, and people aren't going to adapt very quickly to these new technologies. They're going to be going into this war where you have the situation where kind of the old world meets the new world, right? And the fruits of the Industrial Revolution are going to be seen in warfare for the first time. So you're able to keep your supplies going in a much more efficient manner, and you're able to supply with much, much better weaponry and artillery and tanks and things like that. So it's going to have a huge effect, right? So these machine guns, the poison gas, tanks, airplanes, which are going to be used for reconnaissance, submarines, right, which are going to be sinking shipping vessels and things like that, right? These things drastically change the shape of warfare and are partly responsible, not even partly, fully responsible for the deaths of so many peoples when the generals are slow to adapt to the technologies and how they approach tactics to deal with those things, right? And that's what's going to lead us to trench warfare, which we were just talking about before. Here you have a picture of one of the early airplanes, which again, they weren't used for aerial bombardment like you're going to get in World War II, in aerial bombing, but they are going to be used for things like reconnaissance, right? You're going to get intricate camera systems that are going to be put on some of these that are going to take awesome photography of the trench lines and things like that, which will be used by the generals when planning their offenses. You have the beginnings of the usage of tanks, right? Tanks are going to be this kind of all-terrain vehicle that's kind of able to navigate the no man's land in between the trenches of the devastated landscapes and the big holes from artillery shells and muck and mud and things like that. Plus they're armored, supposedly anyway, so being able to kind of fight off some of that machine guns and artillery as it's coming in is going to, hopefully, the thought was, give them some protection and an advantage in the war. We have the introduction of poison gas, right? Mustard gas is going to be used, which is going to be this extremely devastating effects on the people, right? We talked about this in class, and the effects of the mustard gas essentially rotting you out from the inside, in particular in your lungs, right? And if you got a heavy enough dose of this gas and weren't protected by gas masks like you kind of see in this photograph, it leads to an extremely agonizing and painfully slow death. And that's obviously pretty terrible. And in fact, the gas usage is so prevalent and so terrifying that you're going to effectively not have any of this being used during World War II, because no one wants to open up that can of worms again because of how terrible the effects of the gas and poison were on your individual. This is just a good photograph of a German U-boat after it had sunk an Allied vessel as it's kind of pulling away from that. So just to kind of show you the effects of these submarines on the shipping. So at the end of this now, you are going to have the Germans in 1918 essentially put everything they have against the West in hopes that they're going to be able to conclude this war. And the Americans are able to get there, and the Germans they're able to move the line, but they're just not able to move it quite far enough. And then the introduction of the fresh American troops into the mix here, and with the French troops and the British troops that were already there, they're able to kind of stop this German advance, and ultimately the Germans are going to be forced to surrender because of internal politics and things. They never actually break their line, they never actually lose necessarily, and that's going to be kind of a thorn in their side going forward, because the German people are going to have a hard time accepting the terms of the treaty, but again, from an internal politics kind of thing, the war just kind of needed to stop because they weren't going to be able to keep up the effort for much longer. So you're going to get an end to the fighting when the Germans surrender, and you're going to have an armistice that's going to be called on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, 11/11, right? On the 11th of November. And that's going to be the end of it, right? The guns are going to stop, and ultimately the Treaty of Versailles is going to be signed a little bit later by the Germans, and other minor treaties by the other Central Powers that are essentially going to kind of draw up the terms for the conclusion of the war. So just to summarize now quickly the terms that the Germans are going to be forced to kind of stomach as a result of their loss here. Remember, they were the ones that technically started first, right? They mobilized first and began this when they marched through Belgium on their way to France. So the Allied powers, the way they see it, they're going to blame this all on Germany. And being the losing power, it's kind of hard for Germany to not have to accept that. Right, so you get what's called the war guilt clause, and Germany has to shoulder that burden, saying that they were guilty of starting this war, right? So as a result, there are implications to that. The Allies are going to be taking German land, German colonies. You're going to have other land that had been taken from France called Alsace and Lorraine, which is this really nice fertile land kind of between France and Germany, where it's questionable kind of culturally which side is which, but the French are going to kind of take this back because the Germans had taken it from them during the Franco-Prussian War. As I said, German colonies in Africa, right, in the Pacific are going to be given to and split up between England and France, and Japan is going to get much of the colonies in the Pacific. So this is, some of the terms here that are going to be going on. There's more to. And the Allies are going to place limits on the German military strength. So they're going to force them to have a significant decrease in the number of troops that they have actively ready. They're only going to be limited to a certain number of airplanes and tanks and so on, right, as a means of trying to prevent Germany from ever doing something like this again. You're also going to have reparations that are going to be forced on Germany. So Germany is going to be forced to pay monetary compensation for the war's damage. It's a pretty serious number. It comes out to billions of British pounds is the conversion, that are going to be kind of paid back, which in today is an astronomical amount of money when you start to factor in inflation and such. But you're also going to kind of get this now creation of a new map of Europe, right? The Ottoman Empire is no longer going to exist because of their support for the Central Powers and the Allies kind of coming in, and it's going to be kind of broken up. You're going to have the establishment of the League of Nations, right? The League of Nations is going to be this entity and this body that's going to attempt to have all of these countries come together and diplomatically solve these problems before anything like the World War would break out again. And this is theorized, or this is kind of suggested by the American president Woodrow Wilson in a speech where he talks about kind of different 14 points that the Europeans should consider going into this peace, and the League of Nations is one of those. And it's funny because the Americans, even though we suggest it due to our own internal politics and dislike between the American Senate and Woodrow Wilson, the Americans are actually never going to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or kind of join the League of Nations. So let's briefly again look at some of the outcomes and global effects here, right? You're going to now have the end of this kind of idea of absolutism and the idea of empires, right? The Russian Imperial Empire is going to be no more. They're going to have been taken over by the Bolsheviks, and the communists will have taken over into the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire is going to dissolve. Turkey is going to become its own independent thing, but the other Middle Eastern countries are going to be kind of split up by the Allied powers, and lines are going to be drawn how they kind of see them. You also have the German Empire no longer existing as well, right? And the Austria-Hungarian Empire is going to be no more as well. Austria and Hungary are going to split. You're going to have the creation of Yugoslavia with other parts of their land, right? And then the colonies' participation, right? The colonies who participated in the war, they are going to kind of see this as their chance, or one of their chances, to kind of demand their own sovereignty, right? If they participated and were helpful in these outcomes for the Allies, to them, there's no reason why they can't, their own sovereignty, right, their own self-determination couldn't be on the table here. So that you're going to have this kind of the rumblings of the beginnings of this kind of rise of independence movements in these colonies across the globe, which you'll get some of them kind of beginning, right, but really this is going to be a much larger thing following the conclusion of World War II. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time.